I guess we're all a little bit sleepy after lunch. So before we jump into this topic, I'm going to start with a little story from the early days of Microsoft. Or to be even more precise, even before Microsoft started, Bill Gates met with IBM. And the IBM guys came in suits, ties, with professional briefcases, lots of documents. And Bill Gates showed up in jeans and a baggy t-shirt. And today it's kind of like normal. We kind of learned to accept that, but back then it must have been quite awkward. So when they met next time, the IBM guys came in jeans and t-shirts, and Bill Gates showed up in a suit. So I don't know whether this anecdote is true or not, but I think that it nicely represents what has been going on for quite a while. Meaning that I keep hearing corporate executives saying, we need to be more like startups. We need to become more innovative. And at the same time, pretty much every startup founder raising VC funding, wanting to become a unicorn, really ultimately what they're dreaming of is building a corporate company, because that's what a unicorn is eventually going to turn into. So I can't help to think that there is a strong grass is always greener on the other side effect. But it's a flawed thinking when you want to think of how corporations or startups should be working together, what kind of cooperation should be built there. And the reason I think it's flawed is that the whole concept of talking about startups and corporation is difficult to grasp, because these two terms are very undefined or not very productive. So when you think of startups, the stereotypes that come to mind or the associations that come to mind, besides the colorful and quirky and whatever, it's small and young companies. And when you think of corporations, there would be old and big, right? These two features are not really effective way of thinking, okay, how these organizations can work together. And I think what creates a much better structure for these considerations is thinking about them in terms of how they create innovation. And innovation not in the sense of any kind of novelty, but innovation understood very specifically as finding solutions to problems, new solutions to problems, so things that have not been introduced to the markets yet. And for this, there is a better heuristic about thinking of that. I like to think of two terms that are more useful for these kind of considerations. So one of the type of organizations are innovators. These companies that are good at trying new things. And usually these are startups, but the problem is that not only startups would fit under this category. So innovators would be good at trying new things, whereas distributors of innovation are very good at delivering existing solutions, those things that have already been validated, and bringing them to the customers or improving on these solutions, right? So an example of that would be, let's say, Intel, which doubles the performance of its chips every year, is not really creating anything new. They are improving, they're innovating on the performance of their chips, but it's not really innovation in this sense. Whereas creating, let's say, a new type of processor that would be built with a completely different approach would be innovation under this definition. So in this kind of heuristics, we could define these corporations with much more specific features, where innovators would be risk tolerant and distributors would be risk averse. Where innovators would be experimentation-oriented and distributors would be efficiency-oriented. And now, in our industry, there is a strong fetishization of innovation, of startups. Everybody wants to be risk-tolerant, innovative, and so on. But if you go to a hospital, you don't really want to have an innovator treating you. You want to have a very distributor type of organization taking care of you, being very risk-averse in terms of how they're treating you, and making sure they stick to processes, stick to things that have been validated before, right? So there is a place for both of these types of organizations. Even though innovators are very in fashion right now, both of these are needed in our society. So I think it's very important to understanding that and thinking of, okay, how do we choose which type of organization we are, and then in this context, what kind of cooperations there might be with the other type. Another way of grasping this concept would be thinking in terms of how these two types of organizations decide what to work on. So innovators would tell consumers what they want. Ford famously said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Steve Jobs had a similar approach. He was famously against focus groups, saying that a lot of times people don't know what they want until you show it to them. And that's true. If you're building something new that hasn't existed before, you cannot really rely on people telling you that they want that, because very often they will tell you the opposite. But at the same time, distributors, so these companies that already have something that's working, something that people already express the want for, they ask consumers, okay, what do you like best? What do you want more of in these products? And not surprisingly, both Ford company and Apple are now running focus groups, even though their founders were so strongly opposed to this idea, even though their founders would decide what the consumers will want. Today, once both the car and iPhone are widely spread in the market, they do go and they ask their customers, what do you like about that? What do you want more of that, right? So both of these approaches have a place in the market. But at the same time, even though I make this strong distinction between innovators and distributors and how these two sets of features are opposing, excluding each other, there are a couple of companies that escape this classification. Companies like Amazon, Netflix, Tesla, Uber, and many other famous startups. They're both very efficient. They're both growing huge distribution channels, and at the same time, they're both finding new disruptive solutions. They're creating really groundbreaking technology or solutions. And I think that the unique aspect about these companies is that they're founder-driven organizations. There is something special about the founder CEO of an organization like this. A founder CEO who has built a multi-billion-dollar organization has a special credibility for trying new things. And when you think of what kind of powers exist in an organization that doesn't have a CEO with that kind of credibility, it's easier to understand why most of companies cannot innovate, why most companies cannot create this disruptive innovation. How many of you guys have read Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen? Okay, 1, 2, 3. All right, so I'm going to give you a brief idea overview of how Christensen was trying to describe that. Right? So he was talking about examples where a company would have, let's say, $10 billion in revenue, right? And then they're faced with a choice: do we invest in a product line that's generating $5 billion in revenue every year, or do we try this new idea, something that hasn't been verified yet and has a market potential of $10 million? The right decision as a manager of the leader of this organization is to focus on the product line that generates these $5 billion in revenue, that moves the needle for this organization. Investing in this new disruptive product is a bad management decision. So not surprisingly, these companies are managed well when they don't innovate. That sounds like a crazy idea, but it is the right decision from a manager's point of view. And it's different for these guys, because they have built these organizations from ground up. They have a mandate to making more bold choices. All right, so you would say, that's great, that's what we need, right? These are the organizations that combine the best of the two worlds. Why are we talking about these corporations? Well, the problem is that they're ephemeral. I believe that they can exist only as long as they have these founder CEOs in charge, and as soon as they're gone, they're going to turn into distributor type of organizations, as did Ford and as did Apple. So we come back to the point of like how this emerges. And I think a good exemplification of that is a mobile game development company. So if you guys are familiar with how games are developed in mobile development, in companies that build products like Angry Birds, it's usually very small teams that are almost completely independent from the CEO and the rest of the companies. Actually, in fact, some gaming company CEOs say, okay, you guys have complete mandate on deciding what you're working on, where you're placing your bets. So these small teams are supposed to take risks and try new things. They're ultimate innovators. And sometimes they struck on the big hit, like Rovio did with Angry Birds. And that's when this company faces a choice. Do we stay an innovator, a company that tries new things and we just put it through platforms like App Store with Google or Apple, and we don't need to build reach to the customers, or we double down on this one product that hit really big, right? So in this case, Rovio could stay small, keep a couple of teams working on new things, hoping to discover next Angry Bird or more hits like that, or build a completely different organization where they add a team that's supposed to do licensing, the team that's supposed to do TV, maybe desktop games and so on, all about this one big hit, Angry Birds, right? Angry Birds have generated, I think, 3 billion in revenue, so many times more than all of the other 30 games that the company had developed before Angry Birds, right? So again, it's a viable choice to actually switch, to stop innovating. It actually makes sense to become a slower company in this case, right? So in this case, it could be a conscious choice because of these other distributors, these other platforms, they actually can stay a small company. But what I think is really interesting is that this division applies not only to startups, but to any kind of organization. I think that you can find innovators and distributors of innovation in government, education, all sorts of organization. And my favorite example is actually Formula One team or racing teams. These are ultimate innovators. These are organizations that are taking risks all the time, and they're experimenting all the time, and their success depends on finding better solutions than their competing teams. So they come up with amazing ideas and amazing technologies all the time. Carbon fiber, rearview mirrors, modern disc brakes, all of these things were developed by teams racing cars and developed cars for racing. But even though they're really great at coming up with these ideas, had there been just these innovators there, we would have never taken advantage of these technologies, right? So this is the world without distributors. This is the world without these boring companies that cannot create innovation, cannot create new things. This is the world in which modern day brakes would only be in the racing cars, or rear view mirrors would be only in the, available during the racing. But these teams are owned by large car companies that are very slow and very non-innovative, but at the same time they have existing distribution channels to millions and millions of customers, and they apply these solutions, these creating innovations that come from the racing teams, and they bring it to all of us so that we can have safer, more comfortable, and faster cars. So that's a good example of how these two types of organizations fit in together and how it can benefit all of us. So if we agree on the fact that this cooperation makes sense and these partnerships make sense, it's time to think of, okay, how do we actually can bring it there, and what kind of partnerships we can build. I believe it takes four necessary elements. So first of all, you need to establish trust between these two organizations. So as we pointed out, they have very different cultures, opposing cultures. One would be risk tolerant, one would be risk averse, one would be experimentation oriented, one would be efficiency oriented. These are very different behaviors. The people working in these organizations are used to different things and different codes of behaviors. So they need time to get to know each other, to understand each other, and build trust. There are some good models out there. I think corporate accelerators or accelerators focused on specific topics are one of the good ways of bringing in the two parties together so that they can get to know each other over a couple of months. And I think more of these models will be developed. Another important element is that in these relationships, it should be a win-win in the sense that both parties benefit from the business model in a roughly equal way, right? So they share revenue, they share benefits. It cannot be a relationship dominated by one side. There has to be some sort of balance of power where both sides need each other, and because of that, they can trust each other. And this finally brings us to probably the most important element of all of that, meaning that if you understand which type you are, then you can also choose not to compete with the other type of organization. What I mean by that is that if you are a large company that is a distributor that wants to work with lots of innovators, you shouldn't be trying to outcompete the innovators. You shouldn't be trying to outcompete the companies that you want to offer, let's say, distribution to, or you want to offer access to your platform to. You shouldn't be competing with the same products with them. You should be competing with other distributors. You should be building an ecosystem that can trust you, and you should be trying to outcompete the other distribution companies. At the same time, as an innovator, you can build a trusting relationship with distributor if you're not trying to, at the same time, build competing distribution channels or access to their customers, right? So I think this is an important element of building trust and long-term relationships between these organizations. And since I still have a couple of minutes, I'll bring up an example of such a program that I think makes a lot of sense. So SAP, one of the largest software companies in the world, has a program called Startup Focus. Has any of you guys heard of it before? No? Okay, one person. So just to give you a brief idea, they created a technology called HANA. It's a database technology that all of their software products are now based upon. And they opened it up to startup community in general. They said, okay, you can use our technology, build on top of that, that's free. But the interesting part is that if you build on top of their technology and you get some traction, you build all kinds of B2B software for the type of corporations that they serve, and you start getting traction, SAP offers you that, hey, we will actually come to you and we'll say, put this product through our network of salespeople. We have 22,000 salespeople around the world. We will take a cut, so we will take a commission on every sale we make, but we will give you access to all of our customers, which include almost all of the companies from top 500 largest companies in the world, 22,000 salespeople. And when you think about that, that's a really good fit for both type of companies. So SAP cannot out-innovate, cannot outsmart these small startups in terms of thinking of what kind of other solutions we can offer. But no startup can hope to build a network of 22,000 salespeople within the next couple of years, usually even next couple of decades. So there's a very strong fit that both sides benefit from. And I hope there's going to be more examples like this in the future. And with that positive hope, I'd like to thank you very much. If you want to read more about topics like that, I sometimes blog on Medium. I also tweet about that on Twitter. Thank you very much. If you guys have any questions, I think we have a couple of minutes.
Yes, we do. We do have the time for the questions. So if there's... I need a microphone, sorry. Just one. Be nice to a speaker, please. Thank you.
Hi. So what is this unlikely advice you were planning to tell? So what is the main thing when you're talking about cooperation with corporation and startups? What they shouldn't do? Like, what are the things they shouldn't do ever?
Sure. So some of the worst examples I've seen, so maybe to give you guys an overview of like how I came by this topic. For the last 5 years, I've spent building a company that was trying to enhance startup ecosystems, right? So we brought all of these different stakeholders together. And what I've seen repeatedly was that somebody ambitious at a large corporation would start a startup program, right? So they would go out to the community and start saying that, hey, we're trying to build partnerships with startups. And they would do some buzz, they would start conversations with a bunch of people. And then after half a year or 9 months, it would turn out that they didn't really have a mandate of a C-level executive from their organization or a board member from their organization, which means that they didn't really have any power to guarantee that any of these partnerships would come through in their organization. So what happened was this trust element was ruined after all, because for a startup that had spent 6 months talking to them and working on this partnership, that then found out that they didn't really have a mandate to do that, or they, like from their perspective, this organization just didn't treat them seriously. That it wasn't about this person; it was about the organization. So I think that this element is unfortunately still very common. That the relationships are ruined because both sides are not treating each other too seriously. So I think this is unfortunately still the most common example.
Questions? Anyone?
So if I can give you an advice, if you're on the startup side, I see you have an investor badge, right? But if any of you guys are on the startup side and you want to work with a large organization, for these kind of partnerships, make sure that the people you're talking to have a mandate within their organization to make such claims, to make such partnerships, because it's not always the case. And unless they're working directly with somebody really high in the organization, ideally a board member, C-level executive, this might not be a serious partnership, right? So I would suggest to really find this out early on in the process. Who's sponsoring this within the organization? Oh, I think there's another one.
Where should I go? Okay. Thank you.
So I've noticed a lot of larger companies are now trying to spawn off their own startups within. So it's not the larger company creating an accelerator, but instead being an incubator of sorts and launching their own internal startups. But in those situations, those companies don't entirely get full autonomy in that they can make their own decisions, be it hiring or be it product. But when it comes down to operational issues, they're defined by the global initiative, by the corporation. So how would you suggest bridging that gap? Because typically, like tooling or contracting, it's a very different methodology, and it can create a lot of tension within an organization.
Sure. There's a two-part answer to that. So first of all, I believe that if you spin out an organization, it should be a really independent organization that has full autonomy in terms of decision power, where they're going, how they're spending their money, what their objectives are, and so on. Because otherwise, if this is not fulfilled, then this element of making decisions that contribute to the product line that moves the needle for the mother organization, that's still going to drive decisions, right? And if the history of this disruptive innovation has taught us anything, the really big products came out of things that didn't look promising at all, right? Like Intel turned down Apple when they wanted to develop a processor for iPhone because they thought it was such a small market it wouldn't move the needle for them, right? And in the end, it became a much bigger market than the core processor market that there is. But if it was like a spin-off from Intel organization and still driven by these main KPIs, they would have never made this decision anyways, right? So I think that this is the important element. The other side of the other answer to this question is that down the line, I think it will not matter. So I had an interesting conversation today with a friend of mine who's one of the world's leading blockchain experts. And he was talking about how the enterprise is going increasingly towards tokenizing organizations, right? Where theoretically, and most likely what will happen in the future is that organizations will actually break down. They will not be these gigantic molochs built into tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, but they will rather be tokenized organizations, meaning that organizations that are essentially programmed on blockchain and exchanging tokens between each other instead of exchanging monetary value between each other. And then you can actually have parts of organizations that today are big companies like, let's say, SAP, BMW, Volkswagen, that have, within this big structure, that have dozens of organizations that are owned by the same kind of overarching group, but they're so independent that they're just working together through exchanging tokens, but have different cultures, different focuses, different structures, right? So I think this is something we're going to be facing in the next couple of decades. Short term, there should be a clear distinction between what our objectives are. All right. Thank you very much, guys. I hope to speak to you later in the course.